You've been terrible. You've been terrible on Gaza. It breaks my heart that someone who wrote good legislation for queers is so fucking terrible on Gaza.
So if you were wondering where the Pride marches were this year, I can report to you that they absolutely are still happening, but like many things on the political left, they're basically imploding in on themselves, and we have no better example than what took place at a trans pride march yesterday to Representative Scott Weiner, who is a longtime quote-unquote ally of the LGBT cause. As a matter of fact, he's completely perverted and insane, but that sort of fits the mold, I suppose you could say. But in what is perhaps the most, I don't know, Democrat, left-coded, just stupid, insane, woke story ever, Scott Weiner, the most radical, arguably LGBT politician in the entire United States of America, got basically heckled and kicked out of a Pride March yesterday for not being adequately pro-Palestine enough. That's right. Now, we remember once upon a time when the Pride March defenders tried to say, oh, it's not actually political, you know, gay people just want to exist or something, whatever that's supposed to mean, right? They exist. I don't know who's trying to erase anyone's existence here, but, oh, you know, that's all what it's all about, and love is love, and this is totally not just like a left-wing political rally. And then now you have it being the case that LGBT and pro-LGBT people are not even allowed to show up to LGBT marches anymore unless you adequately stand on the side of leftists on a completely separate foreign policy issue. So it's quite hilarious to watch, but it stands as yet another example of how Democrat politicians like Scott Weiner themselves have tried to craft and mold a very aggressive, radical, far-left voter base over the years and are now sitting there shocked as the insane, mentally ill lunatics that they've uplifted and promoted and begged for votes now are turning against them, and it's quite a sight to watch. Anyways, we'll explain for you this whole story and what went down. First, though, do us a favor. If you enjoy our content, make sure you hit that like button down below. Subscribe to the channel if you are new. That is the best way to support our work, and it also ensures that you can stay up to date with all of the latest news and coverage. And with that said, so Scott Weiner, especially if you follow just crazy headlines throughout the years out of California, is a politician that you may be familiar with. Now, he is not to be confused with Anthony Weiner. That's the infamous guy from 2015 or so when he was like that crazy sex pest within the Democrat Party and very close with Hillary Clinton and all that stuff. No, Scott Weiner is a different guy, however, very much living up to the Weiner name, and in his own ways, in many ways, yes, still an absolutely perverted freak, but this is basically the guy out of California that's been implementing all of the insane, just disgusting trans legislation. For example, let me go through the list just so you understand who this guy is. So back in 2020, he introduced a bill in the California state legislature that would require California prisons to house inmates according to their gender identity. So, in other words, if a male inmate identifies as a female, they're allowed to go to the female prison and do, you know, what you could imagine they're going to do. Now, I recall as many times throughout the years, leftists tried to tell us, oh, that's not happening. You're just a conspiracy theorist. What are you talking about? Men in the female prisons. And like I said, this guy is so insane. Mr. Weiner himself, very ironic last name, by the way, right? That he's basically spent his entire political career vindicating everything that right-wingers have been claiming is happening, proving, yes, indeed, Democrats are doing this. But yeah, that's how crazy he is, right? He wants to put the men in the female prisons on the political record. Likewise, he introduced another bill that would give judges discretion for sex offender registry placement for consensual sex between a minor of 14 to 17 years old and an adult within 10 years of age, specifically designed to end prior disparity, treating same-sex acts more harshly than opposite-sex ones, which is to say, he tried to reduce the penalties for a gay predator in many cases, right? Grooming an underage child. Like, this is what he literally did. In order to eliminate homophobia or something like that, right? So literally he wanted to make grooming be basically a misdemeanor and not like an actual sex offender offense. So you know, again, what have we been saying about the grooming? They said that wasn't real. And then you have Scott Weiner, as I said, vindicating every single thing. So this is just the insane lunatic that he is. Likewise, back in 2022, tried to make California a sanctuary for transgender youth and families seeking gender affirming care. You know how that stuff goes. So let's just mutilate children effectively. He's also the guy in California that you may remember tried to reduce penalties for knowingly giving people HIV, knowingly exposing people to HIV. So remember, California degraded that from a felony to a misdemeanor. That was the bill introduced by Scott Weiner himself. So a lot of different stuff, but you basically get the idea, right? This guy is a completely like radical LGBT lunatic. You get the picture. So you would expect him being this insane leftist that showing up to a pride march of all places, he should be lauded as the hero from especially like these crazy insane people, right? But apparently yesterday, as you can see right here, in a spectacular case of these people consuming themselves, Scott Weiner, again, the most radical, perverted, insane LGBT politician in the country, showed up to the trans march, and for the first time, he was kicked out by radical leftists. And why is that the case? Well, this guy says it himself. It's sad because while he's written some good legislation for queers, he's ultimately supporting a genocidal supporting center-right shill. That is right. The guy who did everything that we just described is apparently center-right, according to these insane communists. But hey, what else can we expect? Check it out for yourself. So here's what happened on video.
Scott, I think your legislation protecting queers, the sex offender registry is fantastic. Like, I really applaud you for that, and I think you deserve to be here for that. But I think your housing policy, and I think your policy, and I think your policy on the genocide in Gaza, and I think your policy on the genocide in Gaza is terrible. I think you do
wrong here. It sucks because you've been wonderful for trans people, and you've been terrible, and you've been terrible. You've been terrible. You've been terrible on Gaza. How could you do this to San Francisco? How could you betray queers? How could you oppress people?
You stopped being queer the moment you started supporting Israel, you piece of shit!
Yeah, well, I'm not sure, first of all, we saw a single person in that video, Scott Weiner included, that remotely resembles a normal, well-adjusted human being, and I'll just put it that way, right? What a complete freak show. But is this not typical leftist nonsense? I mean, it is actually very normal type of behavior here. You have the furthest left, most insane, as we described, radical LGBT politician in the entire country. And he's an elected Democrat now running for Congress. But the moment he shows up to a pride march, he gets driven out by the Antifa, who are saying that he is effectively a right-wing guy. They're screaming at him over Gaza and all this stuff. Apparently, Scott Weiner is not bringing trans surgeries for kids to the Palestinians or something, so therefore he needs to be driven out. And hey, a typical case study of how, first of all, yes, the voters are sort of eating the Democrat politicians alive, but as we've pointed out many times, I know there's this conventional logic in American politics, oh, the people are united, guys, it's just the politicians are the problem, the politicians are dividing us. Sure, in many ways, Democrat politicians share a ton of this blame. Absolutely. I mean, Scott Weiner, you could argue, was egging this stuff on for years. And do we feel bad for him that his own people are eating him alive? Absolutely not. But let's also not ignore the fact, and we've tried to bring this up over and over again, it's not just the politicians. It's the voters. It is the Democrat Party's voter base who is this insane. In many ways, I could argue the reason the Democrat politicians are acting so ridiculous and crazy is because look at how their voters act. Look at what the voters are pushing them to do. And by the way, let this stand as yet another reminder. If you think for whatever reason that maybe once Trump is gone, Democrats could just go back to normal, hey, maybe President Gavin Newsom pivots to be another Bill Clinton or something like this, The reason why that's impossible to happen is not even necessarily because maybe deep down the politicians believe one thing or the other. It's because look at their voter base. Look how crazy these people are. That will always prevent the Democrat Party from going back to your grandfather's Democrat Party. So when you want to ask, what happened to the old Democrat Party? What happened to the party of the Clintons and the JFK and people like that? Ask the voters themselves, right? On some level, I mean, there's no such thing as pure 100% democracy anywhere, but on some level, yes, it is part. I understand there's also super delegates and things like that, sure, in the DNC especially, but on some level, please also understand it is sort of the Democrat voter base who is picking and choosing this insanity, and that's a story you've seen repeatedly. I mean, this is far from the first example we've shown on this channel of, hey, here's a Democrat politician kind of seen as an establishment darling, even though, again, this guy is far from moderate as we described his political record, but obviously not pro-Palestine enough for the far-left activist base, who is getting effectively canceled by hordes of Democrat voters, And by the way, what does it say about the Pride movement, vindicating everything we've said for many years that, oh, this is just like a far left political movement? Because again, let's think back to what they said about LGBT during maybe the Obama years or the first Trump presidency, Hey, right wingers, why do you have such a problem with pride marches, bro? It's not political, bro. We're just trying to say that love is love or something. And we pointed out, dude, first of all, look at the insane, freakish things you're trying to show to kids and all that. But then secondly, I mean, obviously, it goes without saying, this stuff has always sort of been a left-wing political cause. And yes, from the beginning, it was never just about love is love or that they would be able to get married and then leave everybody else alone. They just want to be in their private lives. No, it was always the goal to ram left-wing social politics, LGBT stuff included, but not even exclusive to LGBT, down everybody's throats. And how do we know that? Well, because notice how at this trans pride march, it's not just about people coming together over a trans pride, which is what we were told, right? Hey, it doesn't matter what your ideas are, as long as you accept gay people, you're welcome here. Everybody's welcome here, right? Love is love. And yet, due to their stance on a leftist issue completely unrelated to LGBT or trans or anything like that, which Scott Weiner is the champion of, right? He literally wants to decriminalize grooming children and trans surgeries and men in female prisons and all this stuff, right? Just a completely insane person. Even he's getting kicked out for what? For what? His stance on freaking Gaza? What does Gaza have to do with LGBT pride? I'm not exactly sure. If anything, you would think that supporting Palestine might be antithetical to LGBT pride, and that's something that we've pointed out, that many conservatives have pointed out many times. But at the same time, you also understand it's sort of part of the left-wing overall worldview of third worldism, right? That's the that's really what Palestine activism is actually about. But still, nonetheless, how telling that is, and this is actually going to be something interesting to watch, because going forward, I mean, first of all, you wonder where the pride marches are this year and why they haven't gotten as much coverage. I'm actually going to guess now, looking at what happened to Scott Weiner, it would not surprise me if a bunch of Democrat politicians who historically show up to speak at these things and go yay and have a great time probably are not actually speaking at them, right? Because they're scared of what happened to Scott Weiner. And they know that's going to happen to them as well from leftist voters. And so for that very reason, perhaps these pride marches are still happening. They're not getting as much publicity because mainstream people have stopped showing up to them, which I find to be hilarious. But also going forward, this clash at some point is going to be inevitable, where the original LGBT pride activists are going to run into now the Gaza activists, the jihadis, the third worldists, right? Because something has to give there, guys, right? Like Islam, for example, Sharia law is not exactly all that compatible with gay pride. So I'm kind of curious to find out who wins that in the end, because it sort of feels like in recent years, the pride activism has been sidelined for, let's say, the Islamic activism, the third worldism, all those things. And we understand fully that leftists just love to sort of pick and choose whatever their current issue is to protest and ram down everyone's throats. But, however, do consider this. It's not just about the far left activists. Who do they import to build their political majorities? It's not just a bunch of hippies that are voting Democrat, right? In many cases, it is foreigners, it is the products of mass migration, it is third worlders specifically. So I'm also curious to find out at some point, right, if this ever comes ahead, whether the third world voter base begins to sort of sour on the Democrat stance on, let's say, LGBT issues, which is not to say they're magically going to become Republicans, but it's going to be very interesting to me to watch whether the Democrat Party quietly, subtly abandons a lot of the LGBT pride issues because they understand now, oh, who are our voter base? Our voter base are a bunch of third worlders who come from parts of the world that admittedly are far less progressive in many ways, right? So maybe we have to shift. Maybe that's, for example, why you're noticing, right? And you actually see it in this video. The crazy, insane Antifa activists chasing out Scott Weiner clearly believe that the Gaza issue is now more important than the trans issue, right? The trans visibility, trans genocide, whatever words they use and throw out and talk about, that's apparently now less important than the political cause of third worldism, which is something I find to be actually very interesting. And maybe we ought to have a deeper conversation about that, right? About how, yeah, actually in some levels, I think it's inevitable. Like, woke is sort of a middle stage tool. You understand? Because, for example, late stage communism, historic communism, many people note is not really all that woke. It's not democratic. It doesn't seem to reflect what the left of today wants, quote unquote, democracy, as they say. But I actually think that's sort of part of the point, right? Inevitably, this stuff gets abandoned for their ultimate goal. And what is sort of third world communism all about? A bunch of resentful masses just like mass murdering and being violent and acting completely insane and taking all the stuff from historically it was the rich people. In modern America, if that ever happens, it's going to be ultimately the white people. And in many ways, a lot of the so-called like woke social activism that they historically were all about and they embrace, that's going to sort of fall by the wayside in favor of, let's say, the third worldism and the black nationalism and things like that, right? And you're noticing that. I would argue that's already sort of happening, but that'll be something to watch, right? When woke gets replaced by just kind of like violent race communism as a whole, which again, you're already sort of starting to see happen in the Democrat Party. So that's another thing to pay attention to. If you start to see the DNC be a little less woke, maybe on, at least on like trans LGBT issues, but more radical on race, that's actually not a good sign. That's not a reason to say race is woke is dead or something. That means, oh, the race communists are now trying to hit their final form, right? Not mid-stage leftism, but final stage communism, where, oh, here's now when we go full on Lenin, full on Mugabe in Zimbabwe, that type of stuff, right? Here's when it goes down. So, something to think about there on that front. But anyways, that said, guys, we'll leave it there for now. Just another very typical story of these people ultimately eating themselves alive, and then they're supposed to be victims over it. No, you created this whole situation for yourself, right? Scott Weiner, take some accountability for the fact that leftists are completely insane, but you're just completely insane as well, just not as insane as them. So, I guess it's a spectrum of the same thing at the end of the day. I don't know how to put it. But anyways, that said, guys, let me know your thoughts. Be sure to leave a like on this video, subscribe to the channel if you were new, and until next time, God bless and peace.